So today we're talking about how to build authentic and engaged communities. And the key word there is really that word, communities. That's really the heart of what we are talking about today. So the community that I am most familiar with is the Ethiopian immigrant community. I'm Ethiopian. I was born in Ethiopia. My father came to the United States when I was 1, and then my mother and I followed him when I was almost 3 years old. We moved to DC, and then when I was about 10, we moved to Maryland. So I grew up in that, we call it the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And in that area, there's a huge Ethiopian immigrant population. So that was the community I was most familiar with. And if you think about really any immigrant community, it's a pretty vulnerable one. These are folks who've left everything behind. They left behind their careers, their friends, their family. They've left behind everything they know for a new opportunity and a new country. And a lot of times, that country is kind of scary. That country doesn't necessarily make them feel safe or welcome or wanted. But for our community, our Ethiopian immigrant community, there was always one place where they felt safe and welcome and wanted, and that was in my mom's living room. This is my mother and I. As you can see, I've always been cute. And my mom was really a community leader. She was a community builder. And when I was growing up, I kind of took this for granted because she's a nice lady, she can cook well, we have a nice living room, so why wouldn't people want to come hang out with us? However, when I really think about it now as an adult looking back on my childhood, it really is interesting that people felt most comfortable in her living room because there were plenty of other people who had nice living rooms, who had nice mothers, a lot of people whose parents cooked really well. So what was so special? What was so magical about my mom's living room? So we're going to talk about that magical living room and what that entailed. So one of the first things that my mom did is she was the first to serve and the last to eat. She was the host that ran around, made sure that you had your first helping, your second helping, maybe even your third helping if she did a good job. And only after that would she grab a plate for herself. And it was a small thing, but it was a small thing that told you that you were important. You were the priority. You were the star of that living room, and she was there to help you out. The other thing she did was she led by observing. She would watch as everyone ate, and she would pay attention to you and your plate. And you might have one dish in particular that you didn't really eat. Maybe you didn't really like it, and she would notice. And she would go up to you and she would say, "Hey, I noticed you didn't like that one dish. Is something wrong?" And you might say, "Well, it was a little spicy, and I'm not really into spices very much." And she'll make a note of that. And the next time you came to her magical living room, she would make sure to have a special version of that dish just for you. And it wasn't a big thing, but it was a thing that told you how important you were, that your little problems were a priority, was something that she paid attention to and she solved. And that's another thing that my mom was always doing. She was always solving these many tiny little problems. My favorite example of this was a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, at Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is a great time to bring together friends and family, have a huge, delicious meal. And in our home, we always had two cuisines. We had our traditional Ethiopian foods, and then we had our American foods, the traditional mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, turkey, that sort of thing. But that year, we forgot the gravy. We forgot the gravy. What were we going to do? How do you have turkey and mashed potatoes without having the gravy? No worries, my mom was there to solve this problem. While everyone was watching in the kitchen, she went and she grabbed the flour and she grabbed the spices and she grabbed the turkey juice. Is that the juice that comes out of the turkey? Whatever that thing is. She grabbed that too. And she put together the most delicious gravy you have ever had, which may not feel like a big deal to you, but you have to understand, we're Ethiopian. There are no turkeys in Ethiopia. This is not a thing that my mom should have known how to do, but she figured it out. In front of everybody watching on that precious Thanksgiving day, she figured it out and she solved the day. Now, these examples that I gave you aren't huge examples, but they're small little moments where she showed how much she cared about your experience, your feeling of safety. And really, if you abstract out these steps, you'll notice that what she was really doing was she was understanding her community. She was building for her community. She was learning from the community, and she was iterating and making things even better the next time. Now, if you are a developer or a designer, hopefully these steps look familiar to you because these are product development steps. These are the steps we take when we want to build incredible websites and web apps and products. These are very, very familiar steps. Now, fast forward many years later, I am now an adult, and I have decided that I want to learn how to code. This is what it looks like when you learn how to code. You turn into a cartoon and your hair gets really messy. And so I decided that I was going to learn how to code, and I spent a couple months on my own learning, and then I did a 4-month boot camp in New York City. And that boot camp experience was huge because all of a sudden I was in a room full of 44 other people who knew how painful it was when things didn't work, and then understood how amazing and magical it felt when things finally clicked. And so I was in this room full of these amazing people, and when I finally graduated, I was so excited about taking all those coding skills and bringing them to life and being able to work as a developer. But here's the thing about that bootcamp experience. It cost me $11,000 and 4 to 6 months without a salary. And this is actually the cheap story. Nowadays, it takes between $15,000 and $20,000 for just a few months of learning. And the thing that you have to keep in mind about this bootcamp experience is that this is an unaccredited institution. There's no degree attached to it. You can't get a student loan. There's no payment plan. You have to pay all of this up front. And really, the main value you're getting is a community. So how do you find that community without having to pay $11,000 and sacrificing months without any income? How do you do that? Well, I understood that community was key, but I also understood that it is inaccessible to most people. But don't worry, I'm going to build a solution. I built the Code Newbie Twitter chat. Show of hands if you know what a Twitter chat is. Show of hands. Oh, a good number of you. Well done. So a Twitter chat is when you have a hashtag. Our hashtag was Code Newbie. And once a week on Wednesday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we would tweet out questions based on a topic. So the topic, for example, might be open source and coding in open source. And the questions might be, when was your first open source experience? What was the pull request you made? What was it like for you? What do you like about open source? And we tweet out these questions from the Code Newbie account. And using that hashtag, people would respond. And before you know it, for that hour, we'd have this dynamic, engaging conversation, this back and forth, with all these people who were also interested in open source. And so we did this for a while, but when you do a Twitter chat, how do you make it magical? What is a magical Twitter chat for this community of people looking for community? Well, for us, it meant a couple things. The first is that we started every Twitter chat with 3 rules. Our rules were that you have to be supportive, you have to be honest, and you have to be nice. And what we did by starting off with these 3 rules was we set a standard. We set expectations that if you were going to hang out with us, you had to follow these 3 rules. But we also did something else. By establishing these rules from the very beginning, we sent a message to people and said, hey, if you want to join our community, here is the behavior that you can expect from us. The other thing we did was we were disgustingly, horrifically, aggressively nice. We would fill your feed with all kinds of emojis. If you told us that you got your first developer job, you'd get so many thumbs ups. If you told us that you made your first pull request, you'd get so many hug emojis. If you told us that you conquered your first coding course, you get so many smiley faces. We filled your feed with love and support and kindness because that is what you need in our community. You need people who are going to cheer you on, who are going to be your biggest supporters, your biggest fans. And what we did by being that person, by being that cheerleader, was we attracted people who were also cheerleaders. And we repelled the people who kind of thought this was gross. I mean, if you think about it, when you're in a bad mood, you don't want to be around happy people, right? Misery likes company, is that the saying? So when you are maybe not a good apple, if you are a bad apple, you don't want to spend time with people who share hug emojis all day. But if you're the kind of person who needs that, who thrives from that, You're attracted to this lovey-dovey, ooey-gooey community. So by doing that, we attracted people and we built this community that was incredibly supportive and loving and nice. Now, things were going well. The Twitter chat was starting to pick up. People are saying very nice, amazing things about these Twitter chats. But then I started getting a few messages from people, a few DMs. And these DMs said, hey, I love what you're doing. I love this community and these Twitter chats. But I'm in London. I'm across the world. When you do your chats, it's 6 a.m. I have to take my kids to school. Or it's in the middle of the night. I'm sleeping. How can I participate? How can I be a part of this? And that's when I learned that Twitter chat organizers and developers have one thing in common. We both hate time zones. So I said, okay, we're going to do something about these time zones, and we're going to iterate and start a morning Twitter chat. So we started a second Twitter chat on Sundays during the day, which opened it up for more people to join. Now here's the thing about this iteration. If those people hadn't spoken up, if they hadn't DM'd me and told me about this time zone issue, we wouldn't have these Sunday morning chats. That idea didn't come from me. It came from the community. So everything's going great. The Twitter chats are thriving. But what I learned from doing about 6 to 7 months of these Twitter chats is Twitter is a great way to go back and forth, a great way to have a dynamic, engaging conversation. But it's not a great way to dive deep. It's not a great way to focus on a person, on a story, on a topic, and really dig into that topic. So what's a better medium? What's a better tool to do that? Podcasting. In fact, my first job out of college was working at NPR, National Public Radio in DC, where all we did was podcasting. We did radio. And I worked for an interview-based radio show called Tell Me More with Michelle Martin. And I learned everything about doing interviews. And so I said, an interview-based show might be a good solution. So I understood that there's lots of technical content out there. There's lots of technical podcasts, but there are few technical stories. There are few podcasts that dig into the journey, the how, the why of a person, of a developer. So I decided that I was going to build the Code Newbie podcast, and this was going to be a magical podcast. But how do you build a magical podcast for newbies, for beginners, for new developers? There were a couple things that they needed. They needed validation that they belonged. Now, there are two dominant stories with how to become a developer. The first is that you graduate with a computer science degree, you do a couple internships at very impressive companies, you get your first tech job at Google or Facebook or some top 10 tech company, and then you're set for life. The other dominant narrative is that you've been coding since you were 5. You had a laptop as a kid, and you were a coding prodigy that built web apps at 12 years old and did everything and anything exciting and interesting all the way through the rest of your adulthood, and you were an amazing programmer. And that's pretty much it. But there are so many other stories, so many other pathways to get into coding. And I wanted to explore those other stories. So we interviewed people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, and many different ways of becoming developers. And we told their stories. And in doing so, we validated the stories of our listeners. And we said, hey, if you used to be a janitor or a teacher or a journalist, that's okay. There's still a place for you. Look at all these people who came from all kinds of unique backgrounds who are developers today. You can do it as well. The second thing we did was we validated that they can indeed do this. This was about inspiration. This is about the quality of the interviews themselves. And I'm going to give you one small example of one thing that I did very intentionally to show you that you can do this. Let's say a guest dropped some type of tech buzzword, some type of jargon in passing. Maybe they said TDD, which is test-driven development. Now, for our audience, they probably don't know what TDD is. Now, as a host, there are two ways you can handle this. The first is to let it go, let it ride, and kind of assume that the audience will maybe pick it up along the way. The second is you can call it out and say, wait a minute, what is TDD? And when you do that, the most common way to do it might be to say something like, For people who don't know what that is, can you explain what TDD is? Which is a perfectly understandable, seemingly innocuous way of asking that question. But when you ask the question that way, what you're really saying unintentionally is you're saying, I know what TDD is. You know what TDD is. But this group over here, these listeners, they don't know what TDD is. And really, they kind of should know what TDD is, but they don't know. So let's explain it for them. You're kind of alienating that audience. You don't mean to, but you are. So what I try to do is I say, hey, what's TDD? Can you explain to me what that is? And I'm signaling, I'm telling the audience, hey, if you don't know what it is, that's okay. I don't either. Let's learn together. And it's a small but meaningful way to validate that they can indeed learn this material. The third, and I think the most important thing that I try to do as a host, is I get out of the way. Even though it's my show, I'm the host, a lot of times I'm the producer, I'm the person picking the guest, I am the least important person on this show. It's not about me, it's about the guests. They are the star. And my job is to make sure they have the space, the room to tell their story. And I'm gonna prove to you exactly how much I get out of the way. This is an interview we did with Chad Fowler, season 5, episode 8. And these are the audio files of what that interview looked like. That top track is me, and that bottom track is Chad. As you can see, Chad likes to talk. In fact, most of the audio waves that you see in my feed are me going, and If you ever want to be a podcast interviewer, those are the two things you need to know. And you can basically just do the job. And here's another example. This is Scott Hanselman, episode 17, one of our earliest episodes. Same thing. I say very little. Scott says a lot. And that's my job, to give him space, to give him room to tell his story. Things are going well. People love the podcast. They're listening. We're gaining traction. We're getting those downloads. And then we launch another podcast called the Base CS Podcast. And in this show, we teach computer science topics in short 20-minute episodes. And the way this show works, there's myself and there's my co-host. My co-host is Vaidehi Joshi, absolutely phenomenal woman, absolutely phenomenal developer. And she plays the role of the teacher, and I play the role of the student. And she teaches me computer science topics, and I'm learning. And in doing so, you get to listen in and get educated along with me. And we did the show for about a season, and then I got a very, very interesting email from a listener who said, hey, I really love your show, and I appreciate it so much because I'm blind. And a lot of the computer science resources out there are not made for me. They're mostly text-based. They're mostly full of images and pictures and drawings, and I just can't consume it. This show is one of the few resources that I can actually use. And that was incredibly heartwarming, but also really surprising, because I never thought of the show as anything to do with accessibility. And that's when I learned about the context of accessibility and how it applied to podcasts. But it made me think, if we are doing really a great service to people who can't see, what are we doing for people who can't hear, who might benefit from those podcasts and can't take advantage of the fact that it is audio-based? And that's when we iterated and we started doing transcripts. And now we do transcripts for all of our episodes, for both the Base CS podcast and the Code Newbie podcast. Now here's the thing, if that person hadn't spoken up, if he hadn't sent me that email, we would not have transcripts. That idea did not come from me. It came from the community. So, we're doing great. We've got our Base CS podcast, we've got our Code Newbie podcast, we're still doing these Twitter chats. But if you notice, all these activities, these products, are all online. And if you're a conference goer, as all of you are, you can appreciate the power of being in person. There's something special about having a conversation with someone you can see physically in front of you. There's something really magical about that. But here's what I understood about conferences. Most conferences are just not made for newbies. They might be made for people who are new to a particular language or a particular framework, but not really people who are new to the world of coding. So I decided that I was going to build such a conference, and it was going to be called Codeland, and it was going to be a magical conference designed specifically for new developers. But what does a magical conference look like? What does that mean? Well, one of the big things is that our audience needs to be able to follow and understand the talks. Now, this might feel very obvious. Of course, if you're going to a talk, you want to follow and understand the content. But this is a particular pain point for our audience, because a lot of times, even those talks that are labeled beginner, you'll sit in the audience and they'll mention some tech term, some buzzword, some piece of jargon, and they'll kind of go through it really quickly, or they don't explain it at all. And our newbies, who are frankly already intimidated by going to that conference, by being in that room, they miss it. And then they can't keep up with the rest of the talk. So what do? Well, we designed a booklet. This booklet is full of cheat sheets that go with every single talk. So this is how it works. You'll go to a talk, you'll flip the book open to the page of that talk, and there you'll see kind of the things you'll expect. You'll see an abstract and a bio of the speaker, their job, their photo, their company. But then you'll see a section of terms and definitions, so that if they say a word that you're not familiar with, you can look down, read that definition, and keep up with the rest of the talk. There's also a section of resources. So if you want to learn more about that topic, if you found it interesting, but maybe you didn't have time to really dig into it, you can dig into it later. These cheat sheets were incredibly important, were such a powerful way to say to our audience, hey, if you think you're going to fall behind, if you miss something, don't worry, we're here for you. We designed a booklet just for you. Now, the other thing that's very special about new developers is they really need to know the why. New developers don't get excited about technology for the sake of technology. That happens a little bit later. That happens with more experience, when you become a senior developer. At the beginning, as these newbies are becoming more comfortable with the technology, with these tools, what they really need to know is, what problem is this tool solving? Who is it solving for? Why does it exist? This context is super crucial. And what we're really talking about is storytelling. We need the stories around the technology to engage and to appreciate that technology. And what this means as the conference organizer is you have to work with the speakers to design talks specifically for this audience. And that's exactly what we did. I personally worked with each and every one of our speakers. I did speaker coaching that was not recommended, it was required for all of our talks. I spent an average of 4 hours per speaker, helping with their outline, designing their slides, and doing rehearsals with them and making sure that they designed a talk geared for our audience. And the last thing that's really important about designing a conference for newbies is making sure it was financially accessible. As conference goers, you can appreciate the price of conference tickets. There are conferences that charge thousands of dollars to be there. But even the ones that are affordable, there's still a cost. If you have to travel to that conference, we're talking about flight, we're talking about hotel. If you have a child that needs caring, you have childcare costs. And those expenses really add up. So to make sure that our conference is accessible to newbies, we had to think about the fact that our audience doesn't work. They don't work for companies that are sponsoring them. They're not quite there yet. They're not yet employed as developers. They're still working as teachers, as journalists, as janitors. They're sponsoring themselves. They're paying for that out of pocket. So for them, a lot of times, they need support. They need some assistance. So we created an opportunity scholarship designed to get people to the conference who otherwise won't be able to afford it. And over the past 3 years, we've brought hundreds of scholars to the conference and made sure they had the same opportunities as people who could afford to be there. Now, this conference is going well. People are leaving rave reviews. They're excited to be there. They're talking about how amazing the talks are and the community is. Now, the thing about conferences is there are a lot of things that can go right, and there are probably more things that can go wrong. And if you have a one-day conference, you have 1 day to get it right. You can't deploy a new build of a conference. If you mess things up, you have to wait until next year so you can fix them. Now, here are all the things I learned, all the things I missed from that first conference. We did not have closed captioning. This was brought to my attention by a conference goer who said, "Hey, are you going to have closed captioning?" Unfortunately, she asked this a couple days before the conference when we did not have enough time to get a closed caption person. Second, childcare. We did not think about childcare until someone after the conference said, "Hey, you know what would have been great for your conference? Childcare." Dietary restrictions. Now, this one is interesting because we did ask people what their dietary restrictions were, and we did accommodate them. But we forgot to label the food, so no one knew what they could eat. And people kept coming up to the organizers, the volunteers, and saying, "Hey, is this vegan? Is this gluten-free?" A small detail that ended up being a huge deal to our conference goers. The last one that I want to highlight is photography and privacy. Now, this one was very interesting. This came to our attention from this tweet, where this woman, Stephanie Hurlbert, who is an amazing person, you should totally follow her on Twitter if you don't, she says, "I love this idea for events and conferences." And the idea is this note that says, "Please do not photograph attendees with this pink sticker." And Stephanie goes on to write, "It helps some people feel more comfortable, but it would have helped me attend events at all after I escaped an abusive relationship and was worried about stalking. I wasn't able to go to any events for months." And this tweet came to our attention from someone in our community who said, "Hey, Code Newbies, maybe you all can do something like this for Codeland. Just a simple yes or no on whether a person wants a sticker at check-in would be super easy." And I said, "Yes, wish we thought of that before the conference, but that is a great point. That's something we can iterate on." So next year comes Codeland 2018, and this is my big chance to fix all those things. And we did. We had closed captioning. We offered childcare. We got those labels for those dietary restrictions. And we had those stickers for photography and privacy. But here's the thing. If all those individual people had not spoken up, if they hadn't said, "Hey, did you think about these things?" we would not have had a better conference. So at the end of Codeland 2018, I give my closing remarks. And I say to the audience, I say, thank you so much for all of your feedback, for all of your ideas. It was incredibly helpful in making this year an even more special, an even better conference than it was the first year. Conference is over. I go back to my hotel room. Everything is peaceful and quiet. I open my laptop, check my inbox, and I have an email full of all the things that we got wrong that year. So here are all the things that we learned. We learned that we did not have enough environmentally friendly options. And I'm going to tell you exactly what this one email was talking about. My big concern with attendees is I wanted to make sure they stayed hydrated. That's one of the big complaints I've heard from attendees is there is not enough water. So to ensure that we had hydrated attendees, I ordered tons of water bottles, way more water bottles than any conference ever needed. And as a result, there were tons of plastic bottles to recycle. And I didn't really think through the environmental effect of that. I just wanted to make sure you had enough water. And this was something that was called to my attention. Second was a prayer room for people who needed to pray throughout the day, something that I personally don't need and did not come to my attention. The third, and this one I thought was really interesting, was a low-carb lunch. Let me tell you the story behind this one. There was one lunch called Picnic, the summer picnic. And it was full of fried chicken and mashed potatoes and mac and cheese, the good stuff. And it was a very heavy lunch. And when you're at a conference for 8 hours, and there's lots of human bodies in the room, and it tends to get a little warm, and you have a very heavy, big lunch like this, you get a little sleepy. And it perhaps isn't the best lunch to have in that environment. And someone said, hey, it would have been nice to have lighter options. And I thought, yeah, it would have been. Didn't think about it. And the last interesting thing was someone asked for bigger seats. And again, something I didn't think about. This woman emailed and said, hey, I'm a bigger person, and the chairs were just too small for me. They were too uncomfortable. Again, something that I didn't think about. And there was this one particular email from a woman who gave very thorough feedback, a nice, healthy list of things that we can fix and improve for next year. And I got that email and I responded and I said, thank you so much for all of your feedback. It was incredibly thoughtful. In fact, it was so thoughtful that you should go to other conferences and take notes on what they do and give them feedback. Then we'd have better conferences everywhere. And she said, oh no, I don't do this for everybody. I did this for you because I know that you'll do something about it. And this reframed my inbox. My inbox wasn't full of all the things I got wrong. It was full of all the people who believed that I cared enough to fix it. But why did they think that? Where did that come from? Most of the work that we do as community organizers, community builders, are done in the dark. No one sees me lugging hundreds of conference booklets from the printer to my car, hoping they're going to fit in my suitcase. They don't see all the emails with the vendors, making sure we have those vegan options, those gluten-free options. They don't see all the DMs from individual conference goers, asking questions, where we alleviate some of their fears, some of their concerns. They don't see any of that. So how do they know that I'm going to fix it? All we have are small, consistent acts that build trust. It was years of doing all these little things that created this trust that this audience had in me, this community had in me. It was constantly going through this loop of understanding the community, building for the community, learning from the community, taking that feedback, taking those lessons, iterating, building a better thing. And it doesn't matter if that thing is as small as a Twitter chat or as big as a conference. It was constantly going through that loop. This is what community building really looks like. And in doing these things, we build trust. We build a stronger community. Being part of a community is wonderful. Being in a room full of people who have the same values, the same hobbies, the same goals as you do is great. It's inspiring, it's supportive, it's motivating. But for the organizer, it's just a lot of work. And just like developers, just like coders, just like designers, there's always something to fix. No matter how good the thing is, there's always something to learn from, something to iterate, something to build on. And it never quite ends. And I remember as a kid watching my mother in that magical living room, and I'd see her running around and getting all the food ready, getting all the chairs, preparing the room for the guests. The guests would come, have a wonderful time, they'd leave, and my mother would collapse into a chair afterwards. And she'd go, oh, I'm so tired. And I would look at her and I would go, oh man, I never want to do that. That looks like a lot of work. Which is kind of funny because now as an adult, I find myself becoming more and more like my mother. I don't know if you've experienced that yet in your lives, but even the way I pick up the phone, the way I laugh, sounds a little bit more and more like my mother every year. But when it comes to community building, all I've ever wanted is to be like her. All I want is to make you feel safe and welcome and wanted. Thank you so much. That's all I got. Do you have any questions or anything? I don't know if there's supposed to be a Q&A. If not, you can come and talk to me separately. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much.